most of us would say it runs verses 1 through 9. Some people add, add it on as all part of one parable, the following 2 or 3 verses there. But I think it's better to look at them as linked than being the part of the parable itself, because it's just Jesus giving that story and then going to make some applications, but he's going to make a series of them. And I think sometimes when you try and make some of the other verses actually be related to the parable, it's because you're trying to not relate them to what then comes after. And as I discussed a little bit last week, and we'll talk about some more tonight, there is a connection there. Although I'll give you a caveat when we get to chapter 17. Now, I will advise you that. So I trying to show you those connections in the end last week while you had all those things fresh in your mind. So it'd be easier for you to see them than just coming into a cold a week later. I read these other verses, but didn't get the opportunity to really discuss them too much. So Jesus's statements here in 10 and 11 at the conclusion of his parable that as I said, I think connects to the following. He says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to?" And I think that one phrase in verse 11 is a really key guidance point for interpretation. As you know, we talked about, had a lot of discussion last week about some of the difficulties involved in the parable of the unjust steward. Uh, when you're trying to interpret it, if you look to the applications that Jesus is making of them, uh, then that statement about true riches, what would true riches be? Yeah, that would be the spiritual things of spiritual value. So basically, eternal life. So the lessons that Jesus is drawing, and I'll enumerate them at the end of this. I got a slide doing that, but uh, he is talking about using how you use the things of this world and how that what that reflects on as far as eternity. And the bottom line is, it if you don't act wisely and honestly with what you have in this world, then you don't. You're not going to do so well as a steward of the spiritual things, because in reality, we always talk about the secular world versus the religious world, right? But the reality for the Christian is that there's to be a complete integration there. And so, if it's true in the physical world, then I need to match that in the spiritual world. In other words, this thing, to give you an example, I've heard many times in my life, of someone saying how they do things materially is just business, and trying to isolate it then from their Christianity and their relationship to God. But Jesus is saying the things you do with what you have in this world do reflect what your service toward God really is. You know, and I think that's the primary thing really in all of the first 12 verses. Because if you look on there, he says in verse 12, "And if you've not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own?" Remember, this is on top of the true riches. So I see your own here as those spiritual blessings. Uh, and then no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. So I said I would enumerate the, and you remember I made the statement last week that one of the ways in which this kind of breaks the typical parable mode is that Jesus makes multiple points instead of one main point out of it. So these are the four that I was referring to. So first off, that the children of the world are wiser about the things of the world than the children of light. Why should that be so? I think it's
Because there's not many people that are in the lights in the first place, and they're not teaching their children
they're not teaching their children what.
about God in the light.
Well,
They're
like,
very wise about knowing how to get things, and they might not always be doing the right way or honest way to do it.
okay,
Worldly people, that is.
It's not what he's.
I think we're getting around it. Think of priorities. You know, again, it always goes back to what value system you're living by. And if you're living by God's value system, worldly things are not going to have the same priority to with you. And if they do, you're not really living by God's value system. And that's part of what he's trying to bring out here. You know, but inherently, because we care more about the spiritual than we do the physical, the children of this world, as far as this world goes, have a leg up on us and always will. And I don't think that that is observed, if you will, or recognized enough. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's going to be the tendency because look at verse 13. That word servant, that's the word slave. Uh, can you be a slave in two different households?
No.
No. What's going to happen if that's the case? One's going to be wanting you when the other one has you, and you know, and if they're come in conflict with each other, what are you to do? You see. So when he mentions that, that's familiar wording there when he uses that, but uh, we are to use our material goods for eternal benefit, and the small things for the big things, and can't serve two masters. So he really does a lot with a small parable, if you will, but they're all closely connected and closely connected to the things that he has been talking about. Uh, let's uh, let's go look at the scoffing of the Pharisees. I tried to show you this connection right at the end last week, but we didn't get to discuss it either. Now, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God." So, first question, how are these Pharisees described? They're described as lover of money. And being lovers of money, it should be easy to see the connection back to what Jesus has just been talking about. Because going all the way back to those lost sons, the prodigal and the elder brother, what was the problem? The problem was they were concerned about worldly things. They were concerned about material values, and it's just gone on from there as we move along. So these Pharisees are described as lovers of money. Is this accurate? And yes, I feel stupid asking this question, but I decided after some deliberation that I should ask this question.
Would this be related to when Christ talks about how those religious leaders were robbing the poor widows of their houses, taking the houses and doing stuff like that. But, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't-
No, you're right. But the reason I asked the question, and my answer to this is accurate, is that God says it is. That you're reading inspiration, and it just again amazes me how often so-called biblical scholars seem to forget that fact. But there is a lot of them that even some that I respect and often read what they have to say, right? That talk here about this being an inaccurate statement. I'm sorry, this is an inspired statement. And then, just like that, you can think of examples that show this. That was the first one I thought of, as you can see it on my list, though, is that, Jesus elsewhere says they were devourers of widows' houses. They mangled their power in the financial realm in such a way that they could take widows' houses from them. Uh, that's pretty bad. Jesus also said that they were completely corrupt inside and out in another passage. Uh, and my favorite is the Corbin. If you remember, Corbin was their word for gift. It means gift, and they were required to get so much each year, as we talk about with the tithe and everything. But they were also required to take care of their parents financially. That was part of God's design. And you raise the children up, and then in old age, the children take care of you, right? I know our culture's gotten far away from that, but that's the biblical model. And it's still a biblical model. It's just, they said it, the world as a whole used to follow it and doesn't anymore. Yeah, but that was the model. But what the religious leader did was to tell the people that if you made a nice donation to the temple, you could call it Corbin, you could call it the gift, and then you could turn around and tell your parents, "Oh, yes, I have an obligation to take care of you, but I had a greater obligation to the temple, and I gave all the money I would have used to take care of you to the temple." And that was a very, very common thing that they had literally created it. The law had no provision for any such a thing. You know, that was something they made up as one of their loopholes that they were so good at making up because their focus was on material things. So I just don't understand at all those who want to talk about, well, it's really not supported from the other gospels. Yeah, so it is. All right, let's look at the next three verses were a little harder for me to split. After I wrote it, I thought I should have probably just broke 16 off by itself. But we'll take it as it comes here. So the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. Can't remember, did I talk about that at all? Because I'm always trying to blitz through the follow up, but I feel it. Okay. So you know that I see that as those who are trying to force their own way in instead of by Christ. And then verse 17, but it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. So this is where a lot of people seem to struggle and talk about the lack of connections, especially with verse 18 that follows, etc. But remember, this little aside started with the Pharisees scoffing at his teaching that they needed to be more concerned about spiritual things than material things. Uh, we expect that kind of thing from the Sadducees because that was in their dogma, but not the Pharisees. I thought 2 weeks back when I was studying this section I thought there's an awful lot for the church you could dig at here, so I'm just gonna kind of scratch it. So, but you could really do some reflecting, I think, on where these Pharisees are in their outlook versus where they started. Because this is something that I see over and over and over in the history of man. And that is, there is a desire to follow God correctly. There always comes a point, usually just, you know, within 3 or 4 generations, where a generation comes along and looks and says, you know, our forefathers have gone down the wrong path and they've started adding on to God's religion and doing these things. Remember, what was the origin of the Pharisees? Do you remember? I know it's been a long time back, but I told you in a lot of ways that they really followed the restoration model as far as their beginnings. In other words, they said, "Hey, we've gotten very materialistic," talking about Israel as a whole, and they've gotten very materialistic. We don't know the law as well as we should do. We don't follow it, and the very name means separatists. So that they they pulled themselves out of the hole and said, "We're going to be the pure, holy children of God and do away with all those man-made things and everything." And yet here they are, a few generations, and now they scoff at the very idea that the spiritual is where you should put the focus on. You know, and Jesus calling himself a teacher, and yet these would be the things that he would teach. So when Jesus goes into verse 17 here and starts talking at what I admit otherwise would seem like out of nowhere about the law of Moses, he is doing that because they have themselves corrupted the law of Moses. They're no longer following the law. What have they done? They've created all of these loopholes. Uh, we talked about the ridiculousness of the Sabbath ones. We just talked about Corbin. We talked about how they could justify taking widows' houses and all. You know, it just goes on and on and on. So you got to understand that before you ever go to verse 18, because that's where verse 18 come in. So a couple of hands ahead. I think you were first.
You mentioned the word dogma, and I've been taught that all the way through in the Catholic Church. They're dogma, right? And so I thought that was actual truth. That was what dogma. Then when I found out that dogma means something that might have happened, something that could have happened, and they basing their religion on things that might have happened. See, so it's not based on the truth.
Right.
Yeah, I remember classes under Brother Turner. He talked about the 7 varieties of Pharisees. There were even the bruised shoulder Pharisees, you know, and it was just unbelievable how far adrift they had gotten from truth.
And they got there. I think it's important to recognize we can't pinpoint specifically, but they can't be more than 300 years old, and they're probably less than that. So they got there within a couple of 100 years, say, from, you know, oh, the whole reason we're forming this group is because we've gotten so far away from God and his law to now his law not meaning anything to them except for how to get around it. And the more esteem you received as a teacher was only related to how good you were at getting around what the law clearly intended. Twain, that's it.
I think that points to the idea of the competitive nature of I can become a little holier than you, in my view, certainly, and maybe in some others' views, by doing things to prove that. And so I'm going to start dressing a certain way, I'm going to start behaving a certain way to prove myself that I am better than my peers. And then in turn gain recognition, which is obviously what they receive by doing that is that recognition, that feeling of power and holiness and righteousness more so than the tax collector. And so forth. So, but it is it's a natural thing. I think when you introduce the competitiveness into this situation.
Yeah, and that, and that definitely goes back to ego and all of those things. I think that that understanding is a big part of the underlying foundation of the greater section here. Going back to if you do things that may be viewed as being good, but you do them for the wrong motives, then you don't get any you don't get any credit with God for that. You get just the opposite. You go back to the teaching uh, of the Sermon on the Mount, and his giving all those examples there, like them giving in the street and praying in the street and all these things, so that they could be seen of men. I think when he talks here, uh, that that is part of that concept that's involved in that money.
Uh, uh, Old cartoon, called Frank and Ernest. Uh, uh, there was a cartoon, it's a classic one, of where, um, there's bumpers that are standing at the pearly gates. And Peter's got a scowl on his face. And Ernest is smiling, but he's wearing a t-shirt. And on that t-shirt it says authority question. And Frank looks at him and whispers to him, I would change that shirt if I were you, Ernie. And so I think that's what I can see a lot of that in this here, because the Pharisees are very much questioning a lot of Jesus's authority and everything. And so they're scoffing at him. It's going to lead into other stuff. But that just came to my mind of that classic.
Absolutely. My all-time favorite Franklin Ernest is the one where they're sitting, they look just as disreputable as can be. Just the total picture of two bums. Today we would say homeless. But they're sitting on a street corner looking all ragged and everything. And I don't remember which one it was, but one of them says, do you ever think that we might be the problem? Or do you believe in fate? And he said, well, I definitely believe in fate, because I know if I didn't, I'd have to accept responsibility for where I'm at. Yeah, always liked that one. But let's watch how he takes it immediately into the verse that to so many seems out of place. I can't tell you how many scholars I've read through years who talk about how this is this is another time. We just brought this in from when Jesus said it another time. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. So, number one of the reasons why they struggle with its sudden appearance here is not understanding what he just said to the Pharisees. He is simply giving a example, just like he did elsewhere with Corbin, of how they are corrupting the law of Moses rather than trying to preserve God's intent. This is not, he says similar things elsewhere where he is teaching on divorce. This is not actually him teaching on divorce here. This is him just citing it as what they have done with divorce. Uh, as how little respect they have for the law of God, how they themselves are corrupting the law of God. So it's simply an example that is cited here. Some people get excited because he doesn't mention the exception here that he does in Matthew about unchastity, putting a spouse away for being unfaithful and being able to remarry. But he didn't need to mention that here because this is not a lesson on divorce. This is a lesson on materialism versus focusing on eternal things. And he's just bringing that in as an example. Remember how he started that back in verse 14 there when they first scoffed, and his first response in 15, rather, he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men." So that was my reference earlier about them caring about what men thought of them, but their motives not being right. You justify yourself in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. So the all their loopholes on divorce, why did they come up with those?
Because
Say it after me. Because they wanted to get divorced. Why did the King of England start a new religion?
Because he
Because he wanted to get divorced, you see.
it's
And so,
the hardening of your heart is one of the reasons why you
Yes.
allow that.
but the hardening of your heart, he's talking about there is toward their spouses, because they want to get divorced. And so, since they want to get divorced, they created every loopholes to where there was just no restriction on a man filing for divorce in Judaism at that time.
Isn't there a parallelism with this, instead of divorced, abandoned, to abandon your?
Well, there were a lot. That's what I'm saying. This is not him teaching on divorce. This is him just giving an example of how they're corrupting. But yes, it's a good example. One of the big lessons I took out of this whole section, to myself at least, was the fact that this is a great example of how, if you want to know what Jesus teaches on the subject, you don't just look at one passage. People go out of here and build a lot of false doctrines on verse 18. But if your question is about divorce and remarriage, that should not be the place you go to look. That's not the purpose of that passage. He's just giving an example. So you can look at Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7 and places like that before you decide what Jesus has to say about divorce and remarriage. As I said, it's not germane here except for as an example that they do what they want to do and don't worry about how God feels about it. Instead, they worry about what? How men look at them. So as long as they can give men a justification, that's all they cared about. That was the problem. And, we have to learn to avoid the same trap. Every individual does. Don't just worry about what people think of you. Worry about what God thinks of you. Yeah. And the result of their teaching was that divorce, why I told you early on in this class, that divorce was rampant in their culture. But that is why it was rampant, because the religious, civil, and legislative authorities that was all rolled up in those religious leaders, they said, whatever. And so I used to, when I was young and used to read some of the rabbis more, you can read some of their arguments about divorce. And there's literally from the equivalent of she burnt the toast one morning, all that kind of stuff in there. And that, what did the Old Testament say very clear? That's what I always like to remind people about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. What we know is what God hates. He hates divorce. He says that very clearly in those exact words in the Old Testament. I hate divorce. So for the religious teachers to come along and basically teach and lead the way for people to get divorces for any and every reason they wanted to, you know, was to not care about what God felt, you know. And it's in encouraging people to divorce that we need to be a lot more careful than we are. We want to argue about the ability to remarry or not remarry and all of these things. He didn't make that part clear. He made the part clear about not getting divorced. And I frankly have never understood how you come away from with that and then go tell someone who's been happily married for 10 years and has 3 kids that they got to split up because when they were 16, they were married for 6 weeks to somebody else, and that was their first wife. You see how you got to be careful and not build your theology around one passage or one verse. That's literally one verse, and that's where people get. So you got to be very careful about that. All right. Now, if you'll remember, sometime back, we did the lepers that start. I thought I did put some questions in, didn't I? No, well, maybe not. Maybe they're all in my head. Well, let's look at the first 2 verses here of chapter 17. I apologize. I guess I have them on another version of this. But because chronologically, like we are trying to do it, those lepers that begin in verse 11 of chapter 17, that's already occurred. And we studied it in Matthew and Mark in the timeline. It comes in here because it fits that overall theme that we were talking about. But we have already discussed it. We came and looked at this along with Matthew's account when we did. So, but I do think the first, I think 9 verses there. Yeah. I think the first 9 verses are still part of this scene where we're at. The caveat, remember I said I'd start verse chapter 17 with a caveat. My caveat is if you look at how chapter 17 begins, it's he said to his disciples. That is often one of the ways in which they make a chronological break. And so you are looking at a different time and place. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that already, if you go back over what we've read in the last 2 chapters, you'll see times where that phrase was there and there wasn't a chronological break. Luke is the most chronological of any of the Gospels. So if you were trying to get a timeline and you wanted to stick to one gospel, you'd stick to Luke. But he does at times go with this theme, and I think 11 through 21 are in there for the theme and not for the chronology. But I think these first verses are because I also think the Pharisees are still there as well. So just like we saw earlier when he was speaking with his disciples, but he wanted those Pharisees to hear it. I think this is the same thing. So looking at 17 and verse 1, and remember, this is right after he's said these things about materialism and about the Pharisees. He said to his disciples, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. What's a stumbling block?
Something that keeps you from following God,
What was that, Patty?
something that keeps you from following God
Something that keeps you from following God?
or jumping.
All accurate. Who's got something different than stumbling blocks?
Lots of stumbling blocks.
Some of the versions have temptations, offense. The word there is what's important, and stumbling block probably the better of the different ways to try and render it. The word is literally the word for the trigger of the trap. So a trap is being pictured, and very specifically, what is being pictured is you're the one who put that little trigger there and baited it up. You know, any of you ever do that with trying to create animal snares or Anything like that? I used to do that when I was a kid. I was really bored as a child. But you know, when you set one of those up, the the whole concept of the trap is you got this bait that you put in there to draw the animal in. When it comes in, it's gonna trip that trigger and either cage you build or whatever. I started out using cardboard boxes, and then when birds were smarter than that, I had to change. But I still remember the first one I ever made in elementary school. I was it looked like a good idea to me, guys, but apparently birds are smarter than that. But that concept is important to understand that this is the word here. Ronnie,
I was looking at it, the Greek word there is
bait stick.
scandalon,
Yeah.
where we get our word scandal from.
And so what he's talking about is an individual who, by their actions, their teaching, caused somebody else to sin. So who do you think that's for? And remember, that's why I said there's no break here. He just threw in the example of them teaching that you can get divorced for any reason you want to and get remarried. Don't worry about it. Nobody cares. You know, and then he says it's inevitable that those kind of snares are going to be out there. But you sure don't want to be the person who set that trap. It's worse to be the person that set that trap than it is to be the one that fell into that trap. That's what James teaches us, right? Preachers?
Yeah.
No. The greater condemnation for us. That is why. That's the concept. So, yes, it's a warning to his disciples, but it's a warning he wants these Pharisees to hear and understand what the great the epitome of the struggle between them is really about. It's about whether you're trying to please God or please men. And if you're trying to please men, then you are leading some people into sin. Yeah. Uh, I often heard somebody preach something that I thought to myself, I do not want to be that person in judgment day. Uh, not not in the least. Uh, and you look at the imagery he gives to go with it in verse 2. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble. And your little ones is the way that Jesus characteristically refers to newer Christians and Paul to weaker Christians. So you're talking about someone, in other words, who takes an action based on your teaching, and yet that action is sinful. Yeah. So yes, that's the punishment for them, but it's a greater punishment for you. What was a millstone?
Big rock that crushed grain.
That's what they used to crush the grain. I always love the arguments that was bigger and smaller here, because here it's not specified. Now, Jesus will use this example in other places too, and he specifies the bigger one in that example, but this is not the same occasion, and it doesn't specify here. But the reason why I laugh is because guess how much the small one weighed? A small one would weigh over 40 pounds. If I tie that to you and throw you in the Gulf, you're drowned. I don't need that much bigger one, in other words. So I think it's just a different time and place where it says it slightly differently, but the concept is still the same. You know how if you like those old gangster flicks like I used to watch, still watch them sometimes with Daniel because he loves those. But you when the guys with the Italian accent asked you if you wanted to get some cement shoes, that's the concept. Jesus is the originator of that concept. You think about that. But that's how God feels about those who teach others falsely and thus lead them into sin. So then he moves into 3 and 4. Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, forgive him. And we don't have to talk about this because we all have no problem with doing this, right?
I wish. Unfortunately, a major problem at times.
How did the disciples feel about it? And this is another place where people want to separate all of these. No, they're all very closely connected. This is the apostles' response to Jesus telling them that. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. What did the apostles know right away?
That they have trouble doing that.
It's going to be hard to honor what you just said, Lord. It's hard to forgive them for once, but they come to me 7 times in the same day, having done me dirty 7 different times that same day, and I'm supposed to say, it's okay. Increase my faith. And when you understand that, I think it's a little bit easier to go into the answer of the Lord there in verse 6. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Now, of course, we understand he's not uh, giving us a license here to manipulate God, to empower us to do things. You've got to look at the context and recognize he is answering their concern that they don't have enough faith. They don't have the ability, literally, to forgive someone 7 times for 7 different offenses in the same day. And I think it's just me. We're getting ready for class, so it's a good time to say this, and then we dismiss. I think that almost everyone misses exactly what he's saying. Because I think what he's telling them is not that just a little bit of faith is all they need to say. I think that he's telling them that if they had uh, faith, it's not the amount and the reason that they personally have that brings about the result. I think he's just teaching about the power of God and what God can do through us if we just trust him. So, in other words, I think he's telling them, you think you don't have enough faith to do what I just said. But if you let God's power work in you, you can do far more than you would ever think, ever imagine. Just like I says in other places. So for me, that's what he's saying there in those first 6 verses. And then in verses 8 through 9, we'll close with this one because it's the last one of these. Verse 7 says, which of you having a slave plowing or tending sheep will say to him when he is coming from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat and properly clothe yourself and serve me while I eat and drink? And afterward you may eat and drink. He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded, you say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. I think in those first 10 verses, you get 4 things here too. And there are 4 things that Jesus feels the need to warn his disciples of, 4 traps to fall into here. The first one, obviously, we discussed at length, teaching somebody some perversion of God's word that then encourages them to sin, leads them into an action of sin. And then, secondly, you got to develop a forgiving spirit. Don't fall into that trap. Got to develop a giving, a forgiving spirit. And then you can do wondrous things, even little old Jew like a mustard seed, if you'll focus on letting God do it and rely on Him to do it. Yeah. I will tell you this, and I bet every one of you has recognized this at some point in your life because it comes with age and various experiences. But you never know what your heart is capable of until it gets called upon to do that. You never know. And so if we focus on God and doing as He wants to, He will empower us to do His will. And then that last one that, a lot of people take offense about, that's what always makes me smile. Because they say, oh, God sounds like this terrible person here. But number one, recognize he's just using a very common situation in their culture. So they have slaves or servants. This is an individual who doesn't have multiple slaves. He has this one slave, and so that slave basically has to do everything. You know, so he works all day in the fields. He comes in, and yes, in the parable, the master would say, "That's the illustration Jesus is using." Okay, He's not paralleling it directly with God. He's taking something from their culture and saying, this is a situation happens every day, and you all know it, you've all seen it, and you know that's that master, that's what he would do. He would expect the servant to fix his dinner first and see that he has eaten before worrying about himself. And since the point is that fourth trap to avoid, don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that you deserve God's grace, that you deserve salvation. And you see how all four of those tick the box with those Pharisees who were there listening to him teach his disciples. That is very easy. I worry about that in church a great deal. That is, to be clear, Christians who view their salvation as a business transaction. Okay, I believed, I repented, I confessed, and I was baptized. Now you will have to grant me salvation. You owe me. This was a fair exchange. In other words, the one was the price for you giving me salvation. That's why it's always important to keep our eyes on the cross and realize that the price is one, as we sing all the times, the debt is one we cannot pay. Uh, if the story really bothers you, like I said, go to chapter 12. Look in verse 35 and following, and then again in 42 and following, and you'll see him teaching this thing that because he's teaching a different lesson, he reverses it because there he's teaching about God's grace, and so the opposite happens. The master tells the slave, hey, you worked hard all day, you sit here, and I will go and I will prepare the meal and bring it to you and everything. It's the importance of context. There he's teaching about God's grace, so he uses the image in that way. Here he's teaching about self-righteousness, and it's a pretty good closure to that section. And yes, I think that's why he goes and throws the 10 lepers in at that point, because they received something from God, and yet only one of them is grateful. Remember when we studied that? And that one was who?
He was a publican, or no, he was a half
It's worse than
half Christian, half Jew.
he was a Samaritan.
Samaritan.
Yeah. The other were Jews. One of them was a Samaritan. Only the Samaritan even took the time to thank Jesus for his physical salvation. So, all right. Class dismissed. I had nothing more.
Rick, it's anniversary today.
Now,